Alright, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. I've been going over a series of video presentations for the Rankin Technical College AWD Application and Web Development 1111 .NET Framework with Web Databases class. The main textbook for the class is scheduled to be ASP.NET MVC with Entity Framework and CSS by Mr. Lee Naylor. I have made the decision to first go over several chapters in the textbook ASP.NET MVC5 by John Galloway of Microsoft and others. I am in the middle of Chapter 14 on test or unit testing, design unit testing basically, and we're talking more test-driven development. We left off right here. Advice for unit testing your ASP.NET MVC and ASP.NET Web API applications. Now, again, we're going to concentrate just on the ASP.NET, and I'm not going to really go over any of the code examples that are in here. All right. So the author says, let's take a closer look at some of the more common unit testing tasks in ASP.NET MVC applications. Well, some of these should just make sense, such as testing controllers. Well, it says here the default unit test project already includes some controller tests. A surprising number of subtleties are involved with testing controllers. And as with all other things, these subtleties between decent and great code can often be found in small differences. Some of this is what we talked about before, really from the start. Number one here, keeping business logic out of your controllers. Remember, the primary purpose of the controller in an MVC architecture is to be the coordinator between the model and the view. All right? The controller is where the URL comes in and it calls the right method to do whatever work has to be done. When we talk about business logic, remember the place for business logic is in the model. All right, and again, this is all stuff that we have talked about already. This is nothing new. It's not meant to be rehashed, but it's meant to reaffirm, all right, the fact as far as what a controller should do. It says controllers shouldn't try to validate that models are correct. That's the purpose of the business model layer. However, a controller should concern itself with what actions to take when it has been told the model is not valid. Because your controller action methods will be relatively simple, the unit tests for your action methods should be correspondingly simple. It says here, to make this advice concrete, consider the case of models and validation. The differences between a good unit test and a bad one can be fairly subtle. A good unit test should provide a fake business layer that tells the controller that the model is valid or not based on the needs of the test. A bad unit test cobbles together good or bad data and lets the existing business logic layer tell the controller whether it's good or bad. Passing service dependencies via a constructor. As it says right in here, to write the good unit test just discussed, you need to substitute in a fake business layer. If the controller has a direct tie into the business layer, this can be challenging. And they give an example on page 417. Favoring action results over HTTP context manipulation. This is heavy stuff. You can think of ASP.NET Core infrastructure as the iHTTP module and iHTTP handler interfaces plus the HTTP context hierarchy of classes. These are the fundamental underlying classes that all ASP.NET is built upon, whether that means web forms, MVC, or web pages. Unfortunately, these classes aren't test friendly, so there's a lot of work you're going to have to do, and they give you some ideas as far as how to start on pages 418 and 419. All right. Again, the idea behind this set of lectures is to give you an introduction into this. We could have a whole class at Rankin just on test-driven development. All right. Favoring action parameters over the update model. The model binding system in ASP.NET MVC is what's responsible for translating incoming request data into values that your actions can use. That request data can come from posts, query string values, and even from parts of the path of the URL. No matter where the data comes from, it says you have two common ways to get it in your controller. As an action parameter by calling update model, or by try update model. We've looked at this in earlier chapters. Using action filters for orthogonal activities, it says this piece of advice is similar to the one about action results. The core recommendation is to isolate code that might be harder to test into a reusable unit, so the difficult testing becomes tied up with that reusable unit and is not spread throughout your controller tests. This does not mean, as it says here, that you have no unit test burden. Unlike the action result situation, you don't have any input or output that you can directly inspect. An action filter is usually applied to an action method or a controller class. In order to unit test this, you merely need to ensure that the attribute is present and leave testing the actual functionality to someone else. That always is going to depend. I mean, if you work for a small shop, you may be one of a handful of programmers. It's not even unrealistic that you're the sole programmer. All right, more work that you have to do then. Testing routes. Testing routes tends to be fairly straightforward after you've figured out all the bits of the infrastructure that need to be in place. And again, the default MVC project template registers two routes inside of the global.asax file. We've talked about some of this stuff before, how this is the default. By default, it calls home, the home controller, the index method of the home controller, and there are optional parameters that you could pass in. Testing calls to ignore route. They give examples on the bottom of 421 and going on to page 422. Testing calls to map route. Says this is probably more interesting because these are the routes that actually match up with your application functionality. I love this too on page 423 there. Testing unmatched routes. Don't. Seriously, just don't. The tests you've written up to now were tests of code that we wrote namely to calls to ignore route or map route. If you test for unmatched routes, you're just testing the routing system at that point. You can, and for lack of better words, almost must assume that it works. All right? I apologize. I have a phone call coming in, so I'm going to have to put this on pause for just a moment. All right, I apologize for that, and let's continue on. Testing validators here. As it says, the validation systems in ASP.NET, MVC, and Web API take advantage of the data annotations library in .NET. Well, we've talked about the data annotations library in, some people would say too much, but we've looked at a lot of it. In addition to this built-in library, MVC adds 2 new validators, compare at and remote at. On the client side, the changes are more dramatic. Well, one thing that the author mentions in here is it's probably a good idea to have some experience working with JavaScript, just because of the fact, remember, that basically what you're doing on the client side is going to involve JavaScript. All right, and they mention in here, the MVC team added support for unobtrusive validation, which renders the validation rules as HTML elements instead of inline JavaScript code. MVC was the first framework from ASP.NET that delivered the team's commitment to fully embrace the jQuery family of JavaScript frameworks. It is common for developers to want to write new validation rules, and most will quickly outgrow what you get built in: the required, the range, the regular expression, and the string length. At a minimum, writing a validation rule means writing the server-side validation code, which you can test with the server-side frameworks. Additionally, as it says, you can test with iClient validate to ensure that the rule is emitting the correct client-side code. But as we go on and we look here on page 424 in this gray box halfway down on the page, if no corresponding client-side rule exists that's a reasonable match for the validation rule, the developer might also choose to write a small piece of JavaScript, which can then be unit tested using a client-side testing framework. Writing unit tests for client-side JavaScript is beyond the scope of this chapter, but the author strongly encourages people reading this book to invest time to find good client-side unit testing system for their JavaScript code. I mean, when you think about it, it's just like anything else. And what I mean is, for this to be successful, it's a team effort. And if you're going to test the heck out of something on the server side, you might as well test the heck out of it on the client side to make sure that it's working the way that you want it, or even more, more importantly, expect it to work. So it says, when performing model level validation, the unit tests sets up the validation context object. This is way over my head, but you can see some of the stuff here, the properties and what they should contain on pages 425 and going on to 426. On 426, they give a very, very simple example of this. And then the author kind of brings it together here right before the summary by saying, of course, all this code is necessary only if you know that your validation attribute requires access to the validation context. If you know that the attribute doesn't need validation context information, you can use the simpler validate method, which takes only the object value and the display name. You know, what's interesting about writing tests, about doing TDD, you write your tests, then you write the code to make those tests come true, all right? As opposed to doing it the other way, where you write the production code and then you write the tests that go along with it. But regardless of the way that you do it, if you work for a company of any size, for instance, I go back to my own roots mentioned earlier when I worked for AT&T. When we got done, we didn't use test-driven development. We did it more the old-fashioned way, where we wrote the production code and then we wrote the tests to make sure that code was correct or incorrect. But when we got done and when we were happy with our stuff, it didn't go into production. All right, we had what were called system testers, and we gave them our design unit document and had them rerun all the tests. Their job was literally to break our code. And if they could break our code, it was considered to be a success. Not that we were successful, but much better we break it when we're in-house than we put it out into production and have it break out there. All right, so this chapter was a very quick little introduction into the entire topic of unit testing. The first half talked about unit testing and even more so about test-driven development. The second half gave some real-world guidance to the best way to do things and not do things when writing unit tests for MVC and Web API apps. When I return, I will be going over the next chapter, Chapter 15, which is on extending MVC. We'll get to that shortly.